This is Genesis session 4. Today we're going to be introduced to Abraham and Sarah, the great patriarch of our Hebrew faith. Genesis part 4, we are still continuing with the theme of people, land, and struggle. And in the next few lessons, we'll not only talk about Abraham, but we'll talk about Isaac, his son, and Jacob, his grandson. It is broken into these sections. From Genesis chapter 12, we have what is known as the call of Abraham. In chapter 12, there is a famine and a move to Egypt. In chapter 13, Lot, who is the nephew of Abraham, separates from his shared existence with Abraham and goes to his own area to live and take his herds and family. In chapter 13, the promise of land and descendants is made again. And in chapter 13 and 14, we have more stories about Lot and Abraham. The beginnings of the people of Israel. In Genesis 11:27 through 11:32, we hear about Terah, who moves from Ur of the Chaldees to Haran on the way to Canaan. So Terah is the father of Abram. Terah is an idol maker. He lives in an urban area, is very well to do. He has a good business making idols for the many gods that are served in the Mesopotamian area. And so he's in the city area of Ur in southern Iraq today. And Abraham then receives his call at Haran to travel on to Canaan, and there he settled in an area known as Shechem. So we oftentimes will say that Abraham was called from the city of Ur, but actually it was Terah who moved from the city of Ur to Haran, and Terah is Abraham's father. So as a family unit, they moved further north and west from the area of Ur, and actually very close to the southern border of Syria, modern day Syria, to an area that was known as Haran. There is where Abraham was living at the time that he receives his call from God. So in Genesis 12, then Abraham moved from the region of towards the region of the Negev, or the dry hills, and the wadis of southern Canaan. Abraham. The call of Abraham is a major transition in the origin story of Israel. The earlier stories of Adam and Noah were part of the ongoing developing story of Israel. We spend a lot of time looking through ancient eyes to try and understand how the people of Israel would have understood those stories. The authors of Genesis are writing these stories for people of their time several hundred years after the fact. It's a good place to pause and to remember that earlier stories are mythologies, where things like lifespans were exaggerated. But as we go further into Genesis, we will see that the numbers become quite a lot more realistic, indicating that we are leaning forward and leaning forward into a more historical era where we can actually identify with people and their manner of living versus mythology. Israel's ancestral history. We'll take a moment to watch about 8 minutes and get some background for this.
In our last session, we talked about some of the gods of Syria-Palestine, whose religious culture was influenced by and, as a result, resembled religious culture in Mesopotamia. In this session, we will look more closely at the historical setting of the religious culture of Israel's earliest ancestors and the development of Israelite religious culture in the aftermath of the event we know as the Exodus. Now, there's this interesting combination in the patriarchal and matriarchal narratives of the Hebrew Bible. This interesting combination of details that do not seem to fit the historical situation of the Hebrew ancestors, but stories that do seem to fit the historical situation. The details, in some ways, in the Genesis account of the patriarchs and matriarchs seem to be intended to place the events in the past. They are details that seem to reflect things as they used to be back before the way things are now. Abraham, for example, is said to come into contact with Arabs, Arameans, and Philistines, among other people, but these ethnic groups had not entered Syria-Palestine at the time when the ancestors of Israel would have been nomadic herders in the region. These peoples did not enter Palestine before the 12th century BCE, too late for Abraham, in other words. Similarly, the ancestors of Israel are associated with several southern cities, cities like Beersheba, and these cities did not exist before the kingdom of Israel was established under Saul around the beginning of the first millennium BCE. Abraham also is said to come from Ur of the Chaldeans, but in fact the Chaldeans did not occupy Ur until the 10th century BCE, around the turn of the first millennium. And the term Chaldeans does not really appear again in the Hebrew Bible until Nehemiah chapter 9, a much later work. The patriarchs are also depicted as using domesticated camels, but camels were not domesticated, as far as we can tell, much before the beginning of the first millennium BCE, about the time the kingdom of Israel was founded. So these details suggest that there was an attempt to put the events of the lives of the patriarchs and matriarchs of Israel into the past, to things, to an earlier age, things as they were then. But in fact, these details did not go back as far as those who wrote the stories thought they did. And so it would seem that the stories about the ancestors of the people of Israel were not written down any earlier than the beginning of the Israelite kingdoms, probably at the earliest at the time of David, and then written down to give a common identity to the diverse peoples who made up the nation of Israel. In other words, giving them a common ancestry and a common identity as the people of Israel. But at the same time that these historical details are incorrect for the period when the ancestors of Israel were nomadic wanderers in Palestine, the stories themselves at a much deeper level do appear to reflect a way of life that was appropriate for nomadic herders, a way of life we also know from tablets from the city of Mari. Mari included a royal archive that chronicles the era of the late and middle Bronze Ages, or I should say the middle and late Bronze Ages, a period from about 2200 to about 1200 BCE. The tablets from this royal archive are frequent in their mention of nomadic peoples. This was a Mesopotamian city, Mari was, and there was a frequent reference to those who were nomadic wanderers in the area. And as a result, these royal archives provide us with some general idea of the sort of life lived by nomadic peoples, exactly the sort of people that the Hebrew ancestors were said to be. For example, the structure of the family of nomadic herders was patriarchal. We hear that term a lot, but what it means in this case is, in its strict sense, that the father's authority over members of his family was absolute. It was patriarchal in the sense that the father was the ruling authority. His power included the power of life and death over every single member of his family. In the patriarchal family, the inheritance fell to the oldest son at the death of his father, but a son could forfeit his right to inherit, and the patriarch, as part of the absolute power that he had, was free to choose which son was to be considered the eldest for the purposes of inheritance. In the patriarchal family, adoption was practiced, but it was practiced within the family itself in a direct line, which means that, for example, a grandfather would adopt a grandson and take that grandson as a son. And this was a way of ensuring the purity of the bloodline and the easy transference of the inheritance from the father to the adopted son. For the same reason, that is, concern for the purity of the bloodline, we find marriage among blood relatives, most often cousins. This was preferred because it ensured the purity of the bloodline and the strength of the patriarchal family. Polygamy was practiced. A man would have many wives in order to ensure a large number of children, a large spreading of the bloodline for the patriarchal family. And since one had many wives, there was a system of status among these wives. The wives had status based on seniority, but primarily on whether or not they had produced children for the patriarchal father. The senior wife who had produced children had the highest status, and the lower status fell to the wives who did not have children, no matter what their place was in the seniority line otherwise. An elder wife with no children had a lower status than a younger wife with children. The patriarchal house, as it was sometimes called, was an extended family. And the extended family included the patriarchal father and his wives, but also included the unmarried daughters, minor children and servants, and then also the patriarch's sons, his grown sons and their wives, as well as their children and servants. So this is a fairly large family unit ruled over by this one patriarchal father. And it seems that these nomadic patriarchal families lived more or less independently and autonomously. In other words, they did not have connections with larger family units, such as clans or tribes, but they existed more or less on their own under the authority of the patriarchal father. Now, these stories are important for Israel, and their background in the Middle and Late Bronze Age is important because all ancestral histories are meant to define who people are. Every people maintains some sort of oral tradition about its own origins, and that means not only its origins as human beings, stories such as the story of Adam and Eve, for example, but their origins as members of a particular group with a distinctive history. Now we can take the example of the American people, for example. Although most people who live in the United States are the descendants of people who emigrated sometime after the Revolutionary War and often after the Civil War, we look back to the founding events of the nation as the history that defines us as a people, tells us who we are. And we evoke the images of the founding fathers and their intentions and their deeds. And similarly, the ancestral history was intended to define the people of Israel, a similarly diverse people, as a single people deriving from a single family with a single common history. Now, the ancestral history in the book of Genesis and the other early books of the Bible appears to reflect accurately the life of nomadic herdsmen during the era when Israel's forebears would have first entered Syria-Palestine. That kind of evidence we have from the Royal Archives of Mari, for example. The stories about the ancestors in Genesis are primarily stories. That is, they have literary intentions. And those literary intentions are not related to whatever value the stories may have as historical reminiscences. They are primarily intended to serve as narratives and not necessarily as accurate reflections of the people's past.
Okay, so I hope that this will help you in the future to understand the stories as we read through Genesis. Just the background of the area, the culture, the time, the style of living, and so on. So in Genesis chapter 12 through 25, the focus in this section is on Abraham and his family, with many stories that are within the larger overall story of the developing nation that will become Israel. We will find intrigue, some just plain deceitful behaviors, and some great love stories. The people in an ancient setting were just as human as we are. In Genesis 11:17 through 27, we have the account of Terah's family. Terah was the father of Abraham, Nahor, and Haran. And Haran was the father of Lot. But Haran died in Ur of the Chaldees, the land of his birth, while his father Terah was still living. Meanwhile, Abraham and Nahor both had married. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah. Milcah and her sister Ishkah were daughters of Nahor's brother Haran. Both Sarai was unable to bear children. So one day Terah took his son Abram, his daughter-in-law Sarai, his son's wife, and his grandson Lot, son of Haran's child, and moved away from Ur of the Chaldees. He was headed for the land of Canaan, but they stopped at Haran and settled there. Terah lived for 205 years and died while still in Haran. So now we have the whole family has moved from Ur in the Chaldees and is moved up into the area of Haran. The Chaldeans lived in the area later known as Babylon. This is where Terah had his idol-making business. The name of the city Haran and the son of Terah, also named Haran, are just coincidental and are no relational significance. No reason is given to us as to why this move towards Canaan was initiated. In chapter 12, we have the direct instructional call that God gives to Abram. And Lord said to Abram, leave your native country, your relatives, and your father's family, and go to the land that I will show you. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you and make you famous, and you will be a blessing to others. I will bless those who bless you and curse those who treat you with contempt. All the families of the earth will be blessed through you. Please keep in mind this last sentence as it relates to the New Testament gospel as well, that all the families of the earth will be blessed through you. God is using creation language in this promise to Abram. Each stage of Abram's journey is like a new beginning. It looks backward to creation, but it also looks forward to the future with a new nation that is being created called Israel. Families stayed together in Bedouin societies, so asking to separate to a far location was an unusual request. Maybe this was the beginning of moving toward a monotheistic belief system. by creating space between old beliefs and allowing time to develop a new way of seeing God. Abram presents a glimpse of the future when a famine drives him to move to Egypt to secure food. In a later story of Joseph, the great-grandson of Abraham, another famine requires Jacob to send his sons for food in Egypt. Even though the history of enslavement of ancient times, Egypt became a place of refuge in difficult times. Both stories echo to us the future Exodus story. Moving to Egypt during a famine, Pharaoh claims the property of women, and then the plagues. In the end, each group is delivered, and also in the end, each time Israel leaves with additional accumulated wealth. Well, some years have passed from what we read in chapter 12. And will God fulfill his promise of descendants to Abraham? In Genesis chapter 15, Abram questions this promise of a son and land. He's running out of time as he and his wife are getting old. What should he believe? What should he do? In Genesis 15, God takes the initiative to prove to Abraham that he will keep his promise. God creates a covenant with Abraham. Remember, a covenant is always initiated by God. To prove it, God presents himself in a fire, consuming a burnt offering, a form of sealing an oath. We will see in Exodus examples of the same presentation of God in the form of fire and as amongst the people to show that he is there. And it is part of his promise. So here's a map. We'll go back and have another map of the area known as Mesopotamia. And we see Abraham on the move. It says he moved his camp toward the Negev, or the Badlands, but he never moved on to the city of Gerar. So initially, Abraham has moved along from Ur with his father up to an area known as Haran up here. It's barely even shown on here. And then he will move to Hebron, and eventually he comes around through the Negev, which is badlands. They're kind of grazing lands for his animals, kind of on the edges of the fertile valleys, and then around and up to Gerar. So this is part of a movement that will take place. So promises. In Genesis 16, we see after Genesis 15 that in Genesis 16, we're getting really impatient for this promise of a son. So then we have the story of Hagar and Ishmael. Hagar is also given a covenant promise. And in chapter 17 and 18, God reminds Abram and Sarah that the promise of a son for them will come to be. So here's the story of the birth of Ishmael in Genesis 16. Sarai, Abraham's wife, had not been able to bear children for him, but she had a maid servant from Egypt known as Hagar. So Sarai said to Abram, "The Lord has prevented me from having children. Go and sleep with my servant. Perhaps I can have children through her." And Abram agreed with Sarai's proposal. So Sarai, Abraham's wife, took Hagar, the Egyptian servant, and he gave her to Abram as a wife. This happened 10 years after Abram had settled in the land of Canaan. Interestingly enough, God does not chastise Abraham for taking the avenue of choosing a surrogate mother. Such arrangements were common in ancient cultures of the area. In a patriarchal system, the firstborn son is the inheritor. And in future stories, we will see that this episode of Abram, Sarai, and Hagar is but part of a pattern of usurping a younger son into the place of the firstborn son. We also saw in the video that in the patriarchal society, the patriarch had the right to choose who would be the inheritor. So the promise is fulfilled after much, much waiting, and time has passed. So we notice that by the time Sarah has become pregnant, that Ishmael is already quite a bit older. He's probably somewhere between the ages of 10 and 12. So the Lord kept his word and did for Sarah exactly what he had promised. She became pregnant and she gave birth to a son for Abraham in his old age. This happened just the time God had said that it would, and Abraham named his son Isaac. 8 days after Isaac was born, Abraham circumcised him as God had commanded. Abraham was 100 years old when Isaac was born, and Sarah was 90 years old. In Genesis 21, verses 8 through 20, we have the story of how Hagar and Ishmael are sent away. If you can get out your Bible and read this section, it's telling about how as Hagar was pregnant and bore a son, and Sarah still was not pregnant, Hagar was very proud of herself that she was able to do this, and she felt like she was a little bit more superior to Sarah now that she had born a child for Abraham. So the child has grown and the years have gone by, and now Sarah has her own son, Isaac. So the two women are even more at odds because they each have a son and whose father is Abraham. And Abraham has the right to choose which child will be his inheritor, but the tradition still is for the firstborn son. And this firstborn son happens to be Ishmael. Well, Sarah is not wanting to have anything to do with that. She does not want Ishmael to take precedence over her son, Isaac. So therefore, she gets Abraham to send Hagar and Ishmael away, which he does, after which an angel has told him that it's okay for him to do so because he would also be counting his other descendants through Ishmael as well as through Isaac in the future. And to Hagar, God extends the covenant promise of a son and descendants. So later we will find out that Ishmael does get married, does have children, in fact has 12 sons, which should sound familiar, as later on Jacob will have 12 sons that become the progenitors of Israel tribes. So Hagar is sent away, and she does find a wife for Ishmael. we will see that Ishmael and Isaac come back together again at the end of the story here. Okay, so for this lesson, we have Simchat Torah, which means it is the end of the cycle of the year for reading the Torah. So as part of the High Holy Days, High Holy Festival, it is the joy of the Torah, which is celebrated in a number of ways. The Torah is wrapped in a special cloth and case, and it is put in a special place, and it is carried around this synagogue by young boys. And the young girls and women will light candles on this holiday from some existing flame that is like possibly either the pilot light of your stove or a candle that's already burning. And so that is what our celebration for High Holy Days is for this coming week. Just as an ending thought for this particular lesson, I was thinking about how Sarah and Abram had to wait. That waiting always seems to be part of the processes in the Bible. There is waiting for the birth of Isaac. There is waiting for the birth of Samuel the prophet. There is waiting for the Messiah, which the Jewish people are still waiting for the Messiah. And then in the New Testament, I thought about the pregnancy of Elizabeth, how she was waiting and past childbearing age, just like Sarah was, and was visited by an angel, or maybe I should say her husband was visited by an angel inside of the temple. And then Mary, of course, the mother of Jesus, wasn't necessarily waiting, but she received the angel visit. And there's an angel visit in these births related to all of these births, the birth of Isaac, the birth of Ishmael, and the birth of Samuel in the book of 1 Samuel, where Hannah is waiting and praying for the birth of a child. And so, I don't know, just thinking about the waiting part. You know, we wait in our lives for many things. We wait and look forward to things. So just thought about that. Anyway, I'll leave you with those parting thoughts, as scattered as they may seem. So for next week, we're continuing reading about Abraham and Isaac, and we will eventually get to Jacob. So just in the future, keep in mind we're reading in Genesis, probably 25 through 36 for Isaac and Jacob. So continue your reading as you can. And I'll see you next time. Have a good week. Hello, welcome back. This is session 4 of Genesis, although this is part 2 of session 4 because it was so long that we didn't make it through the whole class, and here we are for part 2. We'll pick up with our patriarchs. So in Genesis chapter 11, verses 27 through 22 is what we are looking at now. These chapters from 11 through 25 that we've been looking at for the patriarchs tell of the beginning of Israel as a people. Abraham and Sarai are renamed. Naming means claiming. So when God renames Abram and Sarai as Abraham and Sarah, we are claiming, or he is claiming them as his people, and they are designated for a purpose. And the purpose specifically is to be a blessing to Israel and to all people. We will see that renaming is a reaffirming process in the Old Testament, and we will see that it happens several times. And I'm back to show you another map. This is a map also of Mesopotamia, or the Fertile Crescent, during the time of the patriarchs. What highlighted in color, I want you to take notice of this time, are the cultures that will be having major influences on the Israelites as we go forward in our study of the Old Testament. The Babylonian kingdom, which we know of the exile to Babylonia, which happens in the 500s BC. And then we have Assyria, which becomes a major military force and conquers also prior to Babylonia. And then the Hittites up here in southern Turkey, or even more towards the continent of Asia, they are a major influence because they come all the way down here into Egypt, and the Hittites and the Hyksos become a military challenge for the country of Egypt, and which will later affect us when we get to the point of studying about Joseph. And you'll see how it'll relate then. So for the time being, just again, I want you to look at the maps and be familiar with it and take a good look at some of the cultures. Another thing I wanted to point out to you is this area called Padam Aram. This area will play a major part in the family life of Abraham and his descendants. So this is a major area. This is where Isaac gets his wife. This is where Jacob flees to when he has problems with his brother Esau. All right, so another good look at maps. So Genesis 12 is the first call of Abraham. It is in Genesis 12 that it says, the Lord had said to Abraham, leave your native country, your relatives, and your father's family, and go to the land that I will show you. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you and make you famous, and you will be a blessing to others. I will bless those who bless you and curse those who treat you with contempt, and all the families of the earth will be blessed through you. Considering a patriarchal society that we are looking at, and how families were bound together, this was quite a big ask for Abraham to leave his family behind and to go away separately to a new place that God would show him. So this is quite an adventure for Abraham to separate himself from his family of origin. The promise of blessing those who bless you brings Abraham into relationship with those outside of the chosen community. Those who treat Israel in life-sustaining ways will receive a response of blessing from God. So in the future, as Abraham moves through his life with his family and moves from place to place, the people who treat his family well will be blessed as well. Promise and blessing continued. The text repeats in the Old and the New Testament this text of blessing to those who bless you. Works itself out in the kingdom of David and in the associated promises to him that are given in 2 Samuel the book of 2 Samuel. And the prophets also in the Old Testament address the theme of blessing on nations, which in turn arises again in the New Testament and has grounds in the inclusion of the Gentile communities into the community of faith. Are the patriarchs real people, or are they just stories? Are they characters whose legends have grown so large that we almost find them unbelievable? Or were they real people who led extraordinary lives? So let's take a look at this lesson, this video, and see if that can help clarify for us.
In this lecture, we will see where the great stories of Genesis begin to intersect with the history and archaeology of what we presume is the period in question, the late Bronze Age. But first, let's just spend a minute or so on this marvelous book called Genesis. In many ways, it articulates all of the great themes that will run throughout the Hebrew Bible. These include the role of God as the creator of the universe and as the principal force of moral justice in the world. It also introduces the promise of a covenant between God and his people, who will dwell in peace and prosper as long as they abide by the terms of that covenant. But along the way, the focus changes. As we saw at first, the scope of the book is universal, encompassing the primeval history of the earth and all its living creatures. From this point forward, Genesis shifts from a wide-angle lens to a close-up. That's when it narrows down to the stories of the patriarchs, beginning with Noah and culminating in the journeys of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, which take the story into Egypt. From there, the book of Exodus prepares us for the dramatic climax, when God delivers his chosen people from the clutches of Pharaoh. And so the question is, who was Abraham, or Abram, as he is called at first? And what can modern science and archaeology tell us about this character? Now, I think it's very significant that the Bible places the origin of Abraham's family in the Sumerian city-state of Ur. Now, that identification is not universal. In the Bible, Ur Kasdim is usually translated as Ur of the Chaldeans, which places the city in Babylonia, the civilization that succeeded the culture of Sumer. However, most scholars accept that the Ur of Abraham is indeed the Ur of ancient Mesopotamia. Even in the 7th century BC, when the prophet Jeremiah refers to Ur, the city was still a place of considerable renown. In fact, as late as the 6th century, when we think the Torah reached its final form, Assyrian kings were still busy reconstructing the magnificent ziggurat that was located in the heart of Ur, as we will see shortly. So I think that the choice of Ur as Abraham's city of origin may have been deliberate. As we saw in the previous lecture, Ur was one of the oldest centers of human civilization from the very beginning. One of the reasons was that the Great Flood of around 2900 before the Common Era eliminated Ur's principal rival, the city of Uruk, thus allowing Ur to rapidly become the dominant power of southern Mesopotamia. It also became one of the world's most prosperous centers of the early Bronze Age. We can see that in one of the most astonishing discoveries of this period, the excavation in 1922 of royal tombs by the British archaeologist Sir Leonard Woolley in a mound called Tel al-Makayar in Iraq. What's so unique about these tombs is that they contain the remains of 74 people, 68 of whom were female. What's more, these bodies were arranged as if they were lined up in a funerary procession. Now, it's unlikely that so many people in the royal household would have died all at the same moment. So Woolley came up with a rather shocking scenario. He believed that when the king died, everyone in his entourage, his wives, his officials, even his servants, were all put to death to serve the deceased ruler in the afterlife. These tombs were also equipped with every imaginable luxury, including jewels, headdresses, statues, cups and vessels, and even musical instruments such as a beautiful harp or board games that the king and his wives could play in the afterlife. In many ways, though, Sumer is truly the cradle of human civilization. The so-called Standard of Ur, a wooden box about 20 inches long, is decorated with scenes of banquets as well as military campaigns. These give us the first view ever of one of humankind's greatest inventions, the wheel, appearing on several war wagons. Here is the forerunner of our modern automobile. But the most important invention of all was Sumer's development of the world's first script. What prompted these people to develop a system of writing? Well, the answer is trade, of course. As the market for agricultural surplus grew, these merchants naturally wanted to keep track of how much they sold to whom and how much that was worth. And so the world's first written records are not love poems, unfortunately, or some great historical epic, but rather prosaic records describing the exchange of wheat for barrels of beer. Now, these early tablets still use rather crude pictograms, essentially little drawings that identify the goods. But through daily use, these pictograms became more stylized in what today we would call an alphabet, using wedge-shaped markings that are pressed into the soft clay with a stylus. Historians refer to this script as cuneiform, based on the Latin word for wedge. This form of writing would rule the ancient world for almost 3,000 years, until the advent of the Phoenician script and a new medium, parchment and paper. Now, why is this so important? It's important because clay, such as these tablets, is impervious to fire. You can set a house on fire and the clay won't mind. It will only get harder. That is why we have actually more records from the Bronze Age than from antiquity, when people shifted to scrolls of papyrus and later of paper, which are fragile. Clay tablets are not. So, who was Terah, Abraham's father, and why did he decide to leave Ur, as Genesis tells us? Now, this is just my hypothesis, but near the end of Ur's third dynasty, during the reign of a king called Ibbi-Sin, so at the end of the second millennium BC, Mesopotamia was invaded by various warlike tribes, including the Amorites and the Elamites. What's more, the city was already in decline because of prolonged drought, another element of climate change that will return in the Bible time and time again. So for me, the story of Terah packing up his family and moving east to the city of Haran makes perfect sense. But why Haran? Well, Haranu in Akkadian means crossroads, and that's exactly what it was, a key intersection in the caravan trade between Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and Egypt, between east and west. In other words, it was the farthest outpost of the Sumerian trade network. But bereft of their lands, Terah and his family had no choice but to change to a nomadic lifestyle, herding livestock. And when Terah died, the mantle of leadership now fell on his oldest son, Abraham, or Abram, as he is called at this stage. His wife Sarai, later known as Sarah, was barren, but Abraham had adopted his nephew Lot, the son of his deceased brother. So now the family and all their relatives are in Haran, and they're beginning to sink roots. Instead of tents, they build houses, they acquire more livestock, and slowly they begin to prosper. They make Haran their home, and everyone is content. But one day, says the Bible, Abraham felt a stirring in his soul, a whisper of the voice of God, telling him that Haran was not his destiny. He must go farther south to the land of Canaan. Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house, says God, to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great. So imagine the shock when one day Abraham comes home from the fields and tells his wife, pack up, we're moving down south to Canaan. Like any other spouse, Sarah probably said, are you out of your mind? We just started to rebuild our lives here. This is the home. This is the home of our clan. And she may have added, besides, who told you to move there? Well, God did. God? Which God? Of course, Genesis doesn't tell us what took place between Abraham and his wife, but I find it very interesting that Abraham takes God at his word. As we saw in previous lectures, Sumer was a society with many gods. A man like Abraham would have been raised in a household that worshipped many of these gods. So why would Abraham readily accept the word of God, who, up to this point, was still unknown? Or perhaps not. This segment of Genesis uses the word El, or Elohim, to denote God, which is usually translated in English as the Lord. Now, tablets recovered from the ancient city of Ugarit revealed that a god named El was indeed revered throughout Syria and even Canaan as the head of the pantheon of gods and the father of creation. It's also interesting that God does not tell Abraham to burn the idols of his ancestral gods that were always present in a Mesopotamian household. He will ask Jacob to do that several generations later, but not yet. So what makes the El of Genesis different is that this God reveals himself to a human being. Thus, with this simple act, I think that Abraham's El signals that he is unlike any of the deities that Abraham may have worshipped before. What's more, God makes Abraham a very tantalizing offer, that once he is in Canaan, God will make of him a great nation and bless all of his descendants. Now, that's a very attractive proposition. And so he and Sarah, as well as his nephew Lot, and all of their servants, leave for Canaan to the land that God will show him. Now, Canaan, the land that today we call Israel, as well as the West Bank and parts of Syria, was very different from Mesopotamia. It was a land of sharp contrasts, of cliffs and wild shrub, of fertile fields and dry desert, squeezed into a narrow strip between the Arabian desert and the Mediterranean Sea. What's more, says Genesis, the Canaanites were in the land, and they weren't particularly keen on having Abraham and his herds trample all over their fields and emptying their wells. So Abraham was forced to stick to the highlands, where the soil was dry, but where the flocks could find shade under the olive trees. Here, in a place called Shechem, Abraham decided to build an altar to mark his arrival. And it is here that God says the words that will resonate through 2,000 years of history, right down to our modern day. To your offspring, I will give this land. Now, at this point, I should address a sensitive question, which is, was Abraham a historical figure or not? In my book, 10 Prayers That Changed the World, I answer that question with another question, which is, why should this be relevant? For us, yes, that is an important question, because we are living in a time when everything must be based on facts, on evidence, before we can accept it as truth. But in ancient times, truth had a very different meaning. These people did not have an internet or television or newspapers. They didn't have the ability to verify whether a story was factually true, and so they didn't particularly care. Instead, they had a different concept of truth, the truth of a story that had survived from generation to generation because of its accumulated wisdom, its experience, its values. We may call them legends today, but for the people in ancient times, these stories carried real meaning, a meaning that lent a tribe its history, its identity, its raison d'être. For these Hebrews, the story of Abraham was a living reality because it validated their faith in a single divine power, as compared to the mixed bag of deities that ruled nations far more powerful than their own. It took guts to do that. And the stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob gave them that courage. And so, as scholars, we can debate the fact that Abraham and the patriarchs were probably literary constructs. But that doesn't take away the great moral truth of their stories. And that is what Genesis is after, to give us narratives that can resonate and inspire people for generations and centuries to come. And when you come down to it, it's a marvelous read, this story of Abraham. It has so many themes that will return time and again throughout the Judeo-Christian Bible. For example, there is the question of who will inherit Abraham's covenant with God.
All right, so that will give you a little something to think about as far as are Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and Joseph, are they real historical figures, or are they stories that are made up? And like he said in the video, does it really matter? Their stories have meaning and they carry great messages for us. So it is probably not to worry so much about how real every detail of the stories are, but to rather focus on the messages. And if you haven't figured out by now, I really like maps. So here's another one for you after he was showing in the video and talking about the movement of Abraham's family. So here is a map that shows you some of the journeys of Abraham, and then his son Isaac, who repeats some of the same places, and then Jacob. And like I think I said in a prior lesson, that this area right here, Paddan Aram, really plays a significant part in a kind of like a bridge between Chaldee or Ur, where things originally started with the movement of Terah, and then from Haran back and forth from this area of Paddan Aram down to Canaan. So we'll see travels back and forth. And we'll sum this up now. Learning to live in the world. Humans are not just recipients of God's action. We are participants. we have a will and an inclination to act on our own behalf, making good and bad judgment calls. Think of Abraham, who in his life made many decisions. He was a participant and a recipient as far as God's action. And the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, trace the long and tortured journey of Israel as it gains the promised land. Israel must experience the very many varied challenges to develop into a people of God. And as they do, they have a particular section of Deuteronomy that we've come to call the Hebrew Creed, that kind of sums up their belief in the laws and in their faith of God. So this is what is really a center of Hebrew belief. Call it the Hebrew Creed. In Deuteronomy chapter 4, verses 6 through 12, you can read this. And it says, "Listen, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. And you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your strength. And you must commit yourselves wholeheartedly to these commands that I am giving you today. Repeat them again and again to your children. Talk about them when you are at home and when you are on the road and when you're going to bed and when you're getting up. Tie them to your hands and wear them on your forehead as reminders. Write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. Be careful not to forget the Lord, who rescued you from slavery in the land of Egypt." So here we're looking into Deuteronomy, which is later than Abraham, but yet this summarizes and calls to point that the Lord is the one and only God, and who Israel follows. Yahweh is the one and only God. And make it the center of your life and teach it to your children. And with that, I still recommend that you continue reading in Genesis as we look forward to our next session. And I will see you in a week.